China.
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 The factory of the world.
The world's most populous country is facing a crisis.
China's population is aging.
Fertility rates are at an all-time low.
Gender imbalance in China.
Rapidly rising number of older people in the population.
It does not have young people to man its factories or join its army.
China is facing a crisis, threatening to end the nation as we know it in the coming few years. China's population crisis has gone from a social worry to a government emergency, as the population decline now begins to affect industry and commerce in the Eastern Giant. While many countries struggle with overpopulation, China, the world's most populated country with more than 1.4 billion people, has a different problem. Their population crisis manifests in that the citizens of the Dragon of the East are just not having enough, fun time. Yes, low birth rates are the bane of the nation. And these low birth rates might be what spells doom for the nation. In this video, I will explain 1. How low birth rates became a problem to begin with, and 2. The social and economic implications on China as a result. Let's proceed.
The rise of China is the biggest event in the recent economic history in the world. So within 30 years, in terms of a growth rate of total GDP, China has break the record.
The biggest jump in GDP since China started keeping quarterly records in 1992. That is a very, very impressive figure. China seems to leave everyone else behind.
China's race to become the #1 economy. The output of what is now the world's #2 economy is expected to surpass that of the US.
The Chinese economy is going to be probably at least twice as big as the US economy.
But, believe it or not, China has a population problem. The number of babies being born is going down.
China's population is aging. Seniors over 65 will make up a full third of the nation's population.
Well, we are about to witness a demographic crisis in China.
As you guys know, YouTube has a habit of restricting my videos. And sometimes it's not even YouTube's fault. It's the brands that run ads on YouTube. They don't want their ads next to quote-unquote controversial videos. So they tell YouTube to restrict controversial videos like mine that cover geopolitics. That means sometimes I have to forego covering certain news topics because I know YouTube will restrict that video. But often those controversial topics are important news that you guys ought to know about. And that's why I launched Global Recaps, my own geopolitics newsletter. Every day I send an email directly to your inbox covering the world's most important news. And there's no third party censoring any topic. If it's important, it'll be in the email so you guys can know about it. These are short and simple emails that take about 5 minutes to read. News topics covered in the emails are unbiased, uncensored, and completely free. So sign up now by going to globalrecaps.com or using the link in the description and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. The seeds of China's present destruction began as a very different issue decades ago. In the late 1900s, China found itself facing a giant problem on its hands: overpopulation. The way the population was growing versus the agricultural output coming out of late 1900s China meant that such levels of population growth were simply unsustainable. In a bid to avoid hunger rampage across the nation, China decided to implement a very drastic set of policies, the most widely known being the one-child policy. Under this policy, families were limited to having only one child. The goal was that by limiting the number of children in every family to one, it would lead to fewer mouths to feed, and ultimately a more balanced population. This worked wonders, as the birth rate plummeted heavily over the decades that followed, so much so that it not only achieved its intended targets, but it then created a culture that has led China into the depths of despair that it is now in. But what the CCP didn't realize was that they were creating a problem for the future generation. You see, because of the one-child policy, theoretically, every couple or two people are only leaving behind one child, which is not enough to replace themselves. That's why the replacement birth rate is considered around 2.1 kids. 2 kids to replace each of the parents, and 0.1 for any unfortunate child deaths. Since the one-child policy didn't take this into account, it was just too powerful at slowing down the population growth. Talk about too effective of a solution. As a result of reduced birth rates, part of the problem with China's population is that it's aging out. As most of the population is approaching, or is in, retirement age, this creates quite the complex. Low birth rates and an aging population? Yikes. Let's look at the problems that come from that. Problems that are leading China into its destruction in the modern day.
The ruling Communist Party says it is scrapping a strict two-child policy in response to the rapidly rising number of older people in the population. Beijing has enforced birth limits for 4 decades, but it's now concerned that a demographic crisis could add to pressure on its economy.
China's population grew by only 480,000 last year. That was the lowest in 60 years.
In absolute numbers, there are 33 million more men than women in China today. The gender imbalance in China is most severe in rural farmlands.
For those who engineered the single-child policy, the gender imbalance has been the worst unintended consequence.
The first social problem that can be easily identified as one takes a walk in the streets of China is that, as a result of the one-child policy,
it began in 1980. Only one child allowed.
Decades of families without brothers or sisters.
These harsh measures did reduce the number of births.
Decades, right, for the population to rebound.
A symbolic example of state control.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
China has an extreme gender imbalance, as the nation has far more males than females. This formed as a result of parents favoring having male children to carry on the family name and bloodline over having female children. Practiced over generations, it seems that the effects are now in full bloom, as China has over 37 million more males than women. As simple as this sounds, this creates a whole host of social and cultural issues that affect the nation heavily. To begin with, China has a problem of bare branches, especially in rural China. This is a Chinese term for men who are single and are unlikely to find a wife in the future. As their presence in the rural landscape has grown, bare branches have increasingly attracted the concern of China's policymakers. In January of 2007, the Central Committee and State Council issued a report saying that the imbalance in the marriage market amounted to a hidden danger for society and will affect social stability. The government's anxiety over the surplus men is more or less buttressed by a growing body of research linking marginalized men to the likely spread of violent crimes, prostitution, sexually transmitted infections, and the trafficking of women. Several studies have drawn a connection between the historical outbreaks of peasant rebellions in China and surplus males. As we all know, the CCP is not a big fan of rebellion of any kind, so this creates a problem for them. Adding to the social problems that are being caused by China's population crisis, you will find that the gender imbalance is creating a high competition in marriage for the few females available. Chinese matchmakers always have more men than women, which means a lot of men go unmarried into old age. This further creates a disproportion in the birth rate, and it has also resulted in the thriving of online communities where young men spend money on females to find closure and comfort. This activity contributes to the collapse of Chinese morality and tradition in society. Consider this. China's population grew to 1.41 billion in the decade ending in 2020. Its lowest rate of growth since imposing a strict one-child per family policy in the 1980s. The National Bureau of Statistics announced that China added 72 million people between 2010 and 2020, an increase of 5.38%, with annual growth averaging 0.53%. As these statistics show, the population crisis in China is only getting worse. Where it becomes an economic problem is that a good portion of China's active workforce is aging, but there aren't enough youngsters to replace them in jobs all over the nation. This creates vacancies in key sectors all over the country, and because there's no manpower, economic growth slows down. As you can imagine, this is the last thing that China wants as it fights to surpass the US definitively in several metrics. The sector that has been affected the most by this labor shortage has been the manufacturing industry, as there is not enough manpower to man the industries in comparison to the past. On the other hand, certain analysts have argued that there's not so much a universal labor shortage as there is a mismatch in labor. The younger generation is shying away from manual jobs like farming and industrial work, which makes up a significant part of the economy. This, therefore, leaves a gaping hole in the labor pool, leading to the same problem: vacancies and slow economic growth. But labor shortages aren't the full scope of the problems that come with China's population aging problem. Other factors exist that are equally as puzzling to solve for the government. The reality of the situation, confirmed by the results of China's most recent census, shows that the silver generation is China's fastest growing demographic. This demographic of senior people accounts for 1/3 of the country's purchasing, a fact that merchants and retailers are becoming aware of and factoring for. With growing spending power, more leisure time, and longer life expectancy, Chinese seniors are becoming a consumer group to be reckoned with. Given their growing will to live their golden years to the fullest, and taking into consideration how nuanced this huge cohort is, brands can create and communicate their products and services properly. China's population of people over 60 years old surpassed 254 million in 2019, accounting for 18.1% of the total population. No other country in the world faces such a significant demographic change. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, China's aging population will reach 330 million by 2030, accounting for 1/4 of the overall population. What this means in economic terms is that there will be a whole portion of China's population that will be retired and not actively contributing to the growth of the economy. Analysts have stated that the demographic dependency ratio, which is a measure of the dependence on a society's total working population, would go from 47% in 2019 to 96% in 2050. What this means is that in the not-so-distant future for China, for every retiree, there will be only one person working. This will undoubtedly put pressure on China's economy, as there will be a strain to take care of the retired population. Extra burdens will be placed on the benefits and the healthcare system, resulting in increased costs all around. Current estimates state that in 2027, retirement funds will peak at 7 trillion yuan, but then go to zero by 2035 due to the number of dependents increasing. As a result, a notable deficit will be felt between its inflows and expenses monetary-wise, and by 2050, the deficit will be in the trillions of yuans. The difficulties in maintaining the liquidity of the pension system are forcing the government to take extreme measures, like attempting to encourage more births and increasing the retirement age. But it might all be a little too late at this point. The government is not oblivious to the problems being faced in China. In fact, the CCP, realizing the trouble that China is in, has long since instituted a two-child policy. In May 2021, the Chinese government announced it would scrap that policy in favor of a three-child policy, allowing couples to have 3 children to try and increase the declining birth rates. This followed 2020, where the birth rate fell 15% to record a dismal 10 million births. In addition, China has started to try and address the low manpower problem by moving towards technological trends and trying to use technology and innovation to supplement the industrial sector. Basically, China is trying to transition the economy from being labor-intensive to a technological one. But it's key to note that the industrial sector constitutes 38% of the overall economy. And until full automation, the labor shortages will be felt in the present moment and for many years to come. These measures, at this point, just seem like desperate attempts to resolve a problem that is now far more than skin deep. After generations of the one-child policy, there are now facets of the Chinese economy that are so deeply ingrained that it will take decades to reverse the effects. The question, much like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, is what will come first? The destruction of China or the rebirth of the nation? Russia is running out of people. During the first 5 months of 2022, Russia's population fell by 430,000. And another study points to another decline of more than 1 million people for 2022 as a whole. For an economy of that size, that is devastating. As you might already know, things aren't exactly going smoothly for Russia. Between the domestic disputes at home, loss of international support, and Ukraine's army gaining ground on the battlefield, Putin seems to be losing on all fronts.
Vladimir Putin.
Russia's attacks.
Russia, spurred by Vladimir Putin.
Russia has now reported a record decline of more than 1 million people.
Explosions at Russian air bases deep inside the country. The incidents could be a major escalation in the war, which so far has largely remained inside the borders of Ukraine.
President Putin put the country on an unsustainable path.
You see, in addition to these challenges, Russia is in a major population crisis. A crisis that might mean the end of Russia as we know it. So severe is this problem that Putin himself has had to go into public to say, demography is the first task. We should have more people, and they should be healthy. Yes, that is just how intense Russia's population crisis is. So how does a population crisis spell the end of Russia? How do demographic challenges pose a big problem at all to Russia? In this video, I'll answer all those questions and more. Brace yourselves as I do not have good news for Mother Russia. The problem of population is not a new one to Russia, but it has intensified in recent times due to various factors that we'll talk about in just a minute. You see, for the past 30 years, Russia's population has been in a steep decline. This is from the time when the Soviet Union fell and heavy destabilization took place. In 1991, at the time of the Soviet collapse, the population in Russia numbered around 148.2 million inhabitants. Just last year, however, the population of Russia was at 143.4 million, according to the World Bank. Alain Blum, the demographer at the National Institute for Demographic Studies in France, is on record saying, Russia is paying the cost of the 90s. When the Soviet Union fell, the country plunged into a serious demographic crisis. For the first time, Russia's mortality rate was significantly exceeding its birth rate, leading to a decline in its population. Putting it together means that Russia has not grown in 30 years, but more than that, it has declined pretty significantly. This has left the Russian Federation with a population pyramid like this. And you don't need me to tell you that it spells trouble for this nation. Once you have the older populations outpacing the younger, the future of a nation becomes compromised, as you will soon see. At the rate at which the population decline is taking place, one can only wonder what Russia will look like another 30 years from now. To make a bad situation worse, the COVID pandemic also worsened the crisis, as Russia suffered among the world's highest fatalities. That helped cut average life expectancy to levels seen a decade ago within the nation. While the epidemic has since subsided and is now largely contained globally, there is still no sign of a turnaround in population decline, as opposed to what's happening in other countries. In fact, there has been a decline in the population by 700,000 people from the beginning of 2021 to the beginning of 2022. That's because the other factors that are contributing to the population crisis are still in full effect. What are those factors? Let's take a look. This one ties in with the collapse of the Soviet Union. When you look at this population pyramid, you can tell that during the 90s, when the Soviets fell, there were very few births in comparison to what was expected. This is because of the lack of stability during that period. As is human nature, people tend to have larger families when they feel safe, secure, and stable. And, well, the 90s in Russia were anything but that. The effect of this is that now, the people of childbearing age are those who were born during that period. Because there were a lot fewer of them, there simply aren't enough of them to drive population growth upwards. This means lower birth rates continue. It's a harsh cycle that keeps births shrinking and the population shrinking even further. Unlike Russia, whose reach is shrinking, how about we increase the reach of our Business Basics family, huh? Please drop a like or comment on this video. I greatly appreciate it. Okay, while we're on the subject of births, at present, the fertility rate in Russia is staggeringly low. Just so we're all on the same page, the fertility rate is the number of children born alive to women of that age during the year as a proportion of the average annual population of women of the same age. That was quite a mouthful. To maintain a healthy population, the fertility rate should be 2.1 going up. Do you want to know about Russia? Well, let's take a look at this chart for your answer. Their fertility rate is just below 1.5 children per woman, far below the 2.1 children needed to maintain the population at existing levels. Russia can't even maintain its population, let alone grow it. Putin is well aware of this and has in recent years tried to put measures that encourage people to have more children. In 2017, Vladimir Putin announced the implementation of a program for assisting families, to provide an allowance for the first child for families whose income is at a certain level. That grant is paid monthly to the children for 18 months, aiding the parents in supporting the family. Putin also extended the maternity capital program, a program introduced in 2007 to assist families with their children. This is done through a lump sum payment of $7,700 to the family. Now, all these measures are meant to encourage the increase of traditional family size and thus to, boost the population. Well, despite his efforts, these measures have not been met with much success. Russia remains in the population crisis it is in. However, low birth rates are not the only reason for Russia's woe. Let's look at another factor: immigration. Let's start with a definition of terms, shall we? Emigration is the relocation or process of people leaving one country to reside in another. We're all on the same page now, right? Okay, good. Emigration is currently one of the main problems that Russia is facing. People are simply leaving the country. According to official statistics from Al Jazeera, nearly 4 million Russians left the country in the first 3 months of 2022. People emigrate for many reasons, including increasing one's chance of employment or improving their quality of life. It's not hard to imagine why many people are leaving Russia right now, especially in light of this year's invasion of Ukraine. Due to fear that the war might escalate to affect the homeland, and also due to several large companies closing their branches in Russia, the Federation is experiencing heavy emigration. It is not just simple emigration, though. It is better termed Russia's brain drain. The Federation is losing its best and brightest to other nations because of the instability at home. According to the Financial Times, some 150,000 people working in new, specialized technologies have fled the country. As tech firms lose access to services, customers, and payments, some tech companies with headquarters in other countries have chartered planes to airlift their employees and other specialists. The destination of these talented exiles are the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Others have gone to Turkey, Israel, or the former Soviet republics in the Caucasus and Central Asia. When you consider that these are mostly working-class, highly educated youth, the impact on Russia's economy will be felt, without a doubt. Imagine educating a generation, and when it comes time for them to add value to the economy, they just leave. Ouch. I doubt anyone can accurately quantify it now, but all that's for sure is, besides affecting the population's dynamic, it will heavily impact Russia's economy in the future. At this point, the Kremlin has to wonder if they have to change their policies, because you can't feign ignorance when this much high-value manpower is being lost. Even Putin, as unyielding as he is, in March, signed a bill granting exemptions for army service and income tax for tech workers. That was in a bid to stop them from leaving, but oh well, can't really say that it worked. Angelina Davidova, a Russian environmental journalist, said, "The current invasion of Ukraine destroys not only one country, but two." This is the best way to phrase what's been happening. A lot of the facts I've talked about in the past few minutes all tie in together with this invasion. It has served a major catalyst for what was already a severe population crisis. A lot of analysts seem to think that Putin's invasion was particularly a mask aimed at solving the population crisis. At least in part. You see, Ukraine has a population of 44 million people who are mostly of Slavic descent from the former Soviet bloc. For Putin, the invasion was not only about capturing territory he believes belongs to Russia, but also about gaining control over a population he wants to integrate into the country. This can be evidenced by the latest population census, where Moscow has included the 2.4 million inhabitants of the Donbass, parts of which were administered by pro-Russia separatists before the current invasion. Russia is basically claiming people as its citizens now. For several weeks, the Kremlin has also decided to refocus its efforts on the east of Ukraine with one objective in mind: organizing local referendums on potential integration into Russia. They are adding territory to the Federation. But most importantly to them, they are bringing human resources. It's crazy to imagine the inner workings of the mind of Putin. However, this war has not been entirely, if at all, favorable to Russia. For starters, whatever pro-family policies Putin has been working on for the past several years, he has just undone it in this one political act of war. The instability that comes with war is exactly the same kind of scenario from 1991 that resulted in few births in post-Soviet-era Russia. Elena Churilova, a research fellow in the Higher School Economics International Laboratory for Population and Health, says, "It's likely that in conditions of uncertainty, many couples will postpone having children for some time until the situation stabilizes." This sentiment is echoed by Alexei Raksha, a Russian demographer, who says, "In 2023, we are likely to see a further decline in the birth rate. During economic crises, people are less inclined to have children, which is logical. Trust in the future plays a key role in a country's birth rate." Did you hear that? Trust plays an important role in having children, and right now, the Russian Federation is void of trust. It is very likely that going into 2023, there will be even fewer births as a result of this war. If this war goes on for years, this low birth scenario will stretch out for years, creating another generation of low births. This is not just random guessing. According to Rosstat, this year, as a result of the war, reported a 5% drop in births in the first quarter of 2022 compared to last year. When you couple this shocking information with the number of deaths that happened on the battlefield, well, it doesn't make for a pretty picture. The numbers are not quite clear, with different sources stating different things, but Western officials estimated at least 15,000 Russian troops have died in the war so far. Ukraine claims that the actual number is 30,000. If the war stretches on for years, this number will keep climbing higher, only making a bad situation worse. Let's also keep in mind that this war is expensive, and with the sanctions imposed on Russia, it will not be surprising to see them cut off their pro-family incentives due to limited finances. With the resistance that Ukraine is putting up, this is likely to be a realistic scenario. Putin has shot himself in the foot, it would seem. Let's be honest. The truth is that Russia is in trouble. It is facing a population decline and a massive brain drain that threatens to cripple the economy for many years to come. All this is simultaneously happening at a time when they are fighting what seems to be an unwinnable war. Already, years of growth have been washed away from the Russian economy, and the longer this goes on, the more the consequences. It really looks like Putin bit off more than he could chew, and much like the demographics of Russia, he is choking hard. Only time will tell if, much like the Soviet Union, Russia will collapse onto itself.
China's economy is crashing, and Chinese youth's morale has hit a new low. Young people in China have so little hope in CCP that they have given up on trying and are choosing to be full-time children. Instead of finding a job or starting a business, they are depending on their parents and hoping for a salary for just living with them. Now, we already know everything going on with the Chinese real estate market, but now effects are spreading. Stock market is crashing, companies are leaving China, and Chinese youth are giving up on their future. All the while, CCP is only making things worse for its citizens. In an environment where the CCP needs more businesses to come to China to stimulate the economy, the communist government is raiding and harassing foreign businesses in Beijing to scare them away. So in this video, let's go over exactly how bad the shape of the Chinese economy is in, and why the CCP is hell-bent on making it worse. First and foremost, as usual, please drop a like on the video. It only takes you a sec and plays a huge role in overcoming the algorithm that doesn't like our videos very much. Let's start with the Chinese youth and how their situation got so bad. We feel like we've shown this chart hundreds of times in our past videos, but here's China's GDP over the past few decades. They've experienced an explosive growth in their economy as China opened up to the world and became the global manufacturing hub. This led to noticeable improvements in people's lives. We can see that if we just look at GDP per capita, millions of people who were born in underdeveloped villages in rural China were pulled out of poverty and now are living a pretty respectable middle-class life. That's a huge advancement in the span of a few decades. If we look at China's income graph, we can see that in 1990, the average Chinese citizen was making $330 annually, and by 2019, that figure is close to $10,000. That kind of increase in a nation of 1 billion plus people is no small feat. The government did have to do a lot of forceful and questionable stuff to achieve this, but it's still impressive. The main issue here is that there were a lot of questionable policies along the way that the government implemented that are coming back to haunt them now. One of these policies was the one-child policy.
China's one-child policy devastated generations of families over its 35 years in effect.
Great-grandmother down through 5 generations. This family is a perfect example of China's population crisis. There's only one great-great-grandchild.
Chinese couples now have official permission to have more babies. The government today got rid of its highly unpopular one-child policy and said couples can now have 2 children.
Fearing overpopulation, the CCP forced families to only have 1 kid. As most of us could have guessed, this led to many problems that we're going to need a whole separate video to cover. But here's a quick summary of what's important for this topic. Because of the CCP's one-child policy, it's expected that soon the country will have more older people than young workers. Here's China's demographic period in 1980, around the time the one-child policy went into effect. This is great for any nation. A lot of working adults and kids. Adults are productive members of the economy right now, and kids will be productive members of society in the coming future. The older population? Well, they already put in their hard work, so now they get to live off of the work from the economically productive members of the society. That's why any growing economy usually has a lot of productive members and a smaller number of non-productive members. But due to the one-child policy, China's population wasn't able to replace itself. Think about it. You need 2 kids just to replace the parents in the future, and maybe a little bit more to make up for any unexpected deaths. That's why the replacement birth rate is around 2.1. But due to the CCP's policy, this is what China's demographic period is supposed to look like in the coming decades. A lot more older people in their retirement, less working age people, and even less kids, which means the future is looking pretty bleak. Coming back to our topic about China's youth, there is a lot of cultural pressure on them. Older generation who worked hard and witnessed China's exponential growth now have their expectations set high. They expect their kids to continue the same progress for the family and the country. They expect the current generation of workers to get a higher education, get a high-paying job, and continue building towards a better life for the family. This is not to say that other cultures don't have the same expectations for their kids, but in China, this expectation is a bit unrealistic with the way the CCP is managing the economy. Because of Chinese culture, a lot of adults are expected to take care of their parents, and sometimes even their grandparents too. Then on top of that, they are expected to constantly succeed in their work life, save up for a house, get married, and keep progressing. This is already too much pressure on a working population that is shrinking in China, but the problems don't stop there.
These are tough days in China for many who are young, looking for work, and just not finding it.
In May, the youth unemployment rate hit a new high.
nearly 4 times the national level.
It's unclear as to exactly what is going to propel this economy forward.
Currently, China's youth unemployment rate sits at a jaw-dropping 20%. Nearly 1 in 5 young workers don't have a job. This is in part due to the Buy Lawn movement, but also in part due to there not being enough jobs. In the early 2010s, the CCP made a heavy push to get China's students to pursue higher education, which sounds like a great thing, and it usually is. The more educated a population becomes, the better it is for the economy. But in China's case, everything didn't go according to plan. The CCP expected China to be a more mature economy by now, but China's economy is still driven mainly by low-income manufacturing jobs. So when the government pushes students towards higher education, these students expect high-income, high-skilled jobs when they graduate. And now, the CCP is realizing that there just aren't enough jobs for all these highly educated graduates. This is creating intense competition between graduates to land what little jobs China's economy does have to offer. In this situation, any competent government would tailor policies to attract foreign companies that need this labor and promote more business activity locally so that graduates can find jobs. But what does the CCP do? The exact opposite, as we will get into soon. When you factor all this in, you can see why finding a job is getting harder and harder for China's youth, and the CCP has been no help. And then COVID hit.
When Wuhan was locked down at the end of January, a city of 11 million people quarantined.
By December the 11th, up to 200 people were likely infected with the coronavirus.
Administration official says the White House is considering more travel restrictions. Tonight, Americans are scrambling to get out of Wuhan, China on a charter flight organized by the State Department.
Even though the CCP did a good job containing the spread during the early days of COVID, you can't say the same for 2022. When COVID cases spiked again in Chinese cities in 2022, the CCP went on an all-out war to achieve its utopian goal of zero COVID. Brutal lockdowns killed countless businesses and stifled any economic bounce back that China's businesses had been working towards. The global economy was also slowing down, which heavily impacted China and its local job market. As you can see, the job market is shrinking more and more, and cultural pressure to be successful is piling up on China's youth as they get older. As we have discussed in previous videos, much like the American dream, the Chinese dream is to get a job and then buy real estate. Real estate holds a very important significance in Chinese culture. Men with real estate are considered high status and more suitable for marriage. Going back to the CCP's one-child policy, since families were only allowed one child, a lot of them favored having a boy over a girl. This has led to a drastic mismatch in the male-to-female ratio in China. There are about 70 million more men than women in China. This makes the competition for marriage even more intense, much like job market competition. This is part of the reason why real estate prices have been skyrocketing in China over the past few decades. And before someone comments, let us clarify. We're not saying this is the only reason behind the real estate bubble. There are many other factors that play a bigger role, but marriage desirability is a small part of the reason behind the price rise in China. Even though the real estate bubble seems to be popping in China, buying an apartment is still very much out of reach for many households. In fact, if we look at this chart from 2016, we can see that many Chinese cities rank in the top 10 worst cities in terms of home prices versus average income of residents. Things haven't improved much now either. We can't find a chart, but here's a table with the same data. You can see there are still many Chinese cities in the top 10. So, real estate ownership is important in China if you want to progress in life, but it's nearly impossible to buy based on average Chinese salaries. Jobs are getting incredibly hard to get because of intense competition for the small numbers of jobs that are available when compared to a large pool of prospects. If you are lucky enough to get a job, working culture in China is intense, especially when compared to the salaries being paid. It's common to see the 9 to 9 to 6 work schedule in China, meaning you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, all while making very little. And if you dare complain about anything, employers have all the leverage since they can replace you in a heartbeat due to the high demand for any job opening. As the situation kept getting worse and worse, and the CCP was doing very little to improve the economy, a movement started brewing in China.
There is an undercurrent of dissatisfaction brewing among the young in China.
Quiet quitting have racked up more than 150 million views on social media app TikTok.
At the time when the job market was hit hard by the nation's economic slowdown, some started thinking, why not just lie flat?
Chinese youth have started giving up on trying in an attempt to force the government to improve the situation. So far, on Weibo, the related hashtag has accumulated over 93.2 million views, and searching for the phrase on Zhaohongzhu results in over 2.6 million user-generated content (UGC) instances. It's spreading so quickly that the CCP has actually started censoring the keywords online. Talking about censorship, some of the videos we're making on this channel are sometimes considered too controversial for YouTube, and the almighty algorithm may not recommend them to you. So, if you guys can take a quick second to hit that subscribe button, it would help us out a lot. Young people have burned out after trying so hard for so long to no avail. This is how they make sense of it in their mind. Someone has to be a loser because of the way the economy is set up. Too many people and not enough jobs. Real estate prices are too high and salaries ain't. So why try so hard if you know you are just going to fail? If you don't try at all, then at least you are not disappointed when you inevitably lose. So that's basically the thinking behind the whole let it rot movement. We know it sounds crazy to some older folks, but that's how it's being looked at in China. Have you guys ever played a game where you are losing so badly that you just stop trying because there's no chance you are making a comeback? So why not at least save the energy? Well, that's pretty similar to how Chinese youth are feeling towards life. Even though it may sound silly to some, this is turning into a serious problem for the future of China's economy and the communist government. CCP officials have publicly come out and said that this attitude will slow China's growth and will result in generations of slackers. State media has already started publishing articles about why the youth should avoid Bailan and refuse that mindset. But so far, the movement is not slowing down. Recent data only shows that things are getting worse. Most recent filing by CCP shows that youth unemployment sits at 21.3%. Keep in mind, CCP is known for padding statistics to make things look better than they actually are in reality. So if it is publishing 21.3 youth unemployment, there's a good chance reality is worse. So after this report went viral, the Chinese government said that it would stop publishing this information from now on. We're guessing CCP thinks that if we don't publish the problem, everyone will think everything's fine. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works. The decision to scrub a widely watched report exasperated the concerns by investors and executives who say ever-tightening government control of information is making it harder to do business in China. First, let's cover why investors are scared, which is causing a crash in the Chinese stock market. China is facing a potential debt crisis. In the non-financial sector, debt as a share of China's GDP has surged from 200% to 300% in the 12 years that Xi Jinping has been in office. Government debt, corporate debt, and household debt levels in China are incredibly high. Although the government would almost certainly intervene to prevent a large-scale financial crisis, it will only create a bigger problem for itself further down the line. On top of all of these macro issues, Xi Jinping also seems hell-bent on scaring away foreign businesses too. Last month, China's newly revised counter-espionage law expanded the definition of what could be construed as spying, a reflection of Xi's heightened security state. The law alarmed foreign businesses and governments because it stipulated that sharing documents, data, materials, and objects could be considered spying if the information had a bearing on national security and interests, a criteria seen as overly broad and potentially arbitrary. U.S. firms in China have long complained about what they have seen as an unfair business environment, with limited protection for intellectual property and preferential treatment afforded to domestic competitors. Those fears have been compounded this year by a broad crackdown on U.S. consulting firms operating in China. Earlier this year, Chinese authorities raided American consulting firms, Mintz Group and Bain & Company. CCP claims that it was for national security reasons, but the true reason becomes more clear once we look at what these firms were working on. There's one topic relating to CCP that we haven't covered on this channel yet, but we're sure you guys know about it already. The topic is CCP's treatment of Uyghur Muslims in China's Xinjiang region. One day we'll release a detailed video on the topic, just waiting to figure out how to tell that story without getting age restricted by YouTube. Anyways, coming back to the topic on hand, because of reports about CCP's treatment on Uyghur Muslims, United States passed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, a U.S. federal law that changed U.S. policy on the Xinjiang region, with the goal of ensuring that American entities were not funding forced labor among ethnic minorities in that region. It was signed into law by U.S. President Joe Biden on December 23, 2021, and stated that commencing 21st of June 2022, any company that imports goods from Xinjiang region needed to certify that those goods were not produced using forced labor in order to avoid U.S. penalties. many companies who operated in China hired consulting firms like Mintz to help carry out the research in their supply chains in Xinjiang province. As soon as these firms started looking into the issue, they were raided for national security reasons by the CCP. We think you guys get what CCP is really trying to hide. This also kind of sends a signal to foreign businesses and investors that doing business in China is not a safe move. Because of all these issues and more, foreign investment in China is down to a 25-year low. Direct investment liabilities, a gauge of foreign direct investment in China, slumped to just $4.9 billion in the April-June period, according to figures released by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. That was down 87% from the same period last year and was the smallest amount in any quarter in data back to 1998. Firms are reinvesting less of their existing profits back into the country and are choosing to bring excess money back to their home. This all led to Chinese stock prices to slide for most of this year. China's benchmark CSI 300 index was down around 4.2% this year as of writing of this script. Global investors have become net sellers of Chinese shares, with outflows from Chinese domestic stocks by foreign institutional investors reaching $10.2 billion so far in August. In hope of reviving the confidence in its market, CCP cut a tax on trading, which did help stock gain a little, but the gains were quickly wiped out. The new measures don't fully address investors' concerns. Investors feel bearish on the economic recovery of China. Changes in taxes don't address the issues with the economy. Economic outlook is looking so bad that CCP is stopping economists and analysts from publishing their true thoughts on China's economy. Many experts outside of China believe that China may be experiencing a similar slowdown to that of Japan in the 1990s. Back then, a bursting asset price bubble triggered Japan's lost decade, resulting in a 30-year period of stagnation. Economic growth slumped from averaging 4.5% year-on-year through the 1980s to 1% ever since. Economists do not expect growth to fall quite so low in China, but the end result for China will be worse. That's because China is experiencing this pressure at much lower levels of per capita income than Japan did. Although Japan's economy slumped, it remained a wealthy nation. China might be the world's second largest economy, but its GDP per capita in 2022 was just $12,756. That is roughly a sixth of that in the US and barely above the global average. If it stagnates now, China will be stuck in the middle income trap. Xi's Chinese dream will die.
This is France. For days on end, people in France have been going out onto the streets to protest. These protests weren't small by any standard. Millions of people in tons of cities showed their anger at the French government. There was one big reason for this. France's President Macron decided to raise the minimum pension age from 62 to 64. Understandably, many people in France weren't too happy about this decision. But for most people, this isn't all that important, right? Well, that's not entirely true. When you look at the reasons behind this pension reform in France, you see that there's a huge underlying problem here. Europe is in the middle of a population collapse. In this video, we'll discuss how this situation evolved in the first place and how serious the problems are. By the way, a quick reminder to please hit that like button. Whenever I show clips of any protests, YouTube doesn't like it very much. So videos may get suppressed. That means your like plays a huge role in the algorithm, so videos get shown to other people. Thank you. Let's look at the pension reforms in France first. Then we'll look into Europe as a whole. The entire situation illustrates perfectly well how problematic this population collapse really is. Like many other European countries, the French government has a mandatory state pension. This means that the government taxes people in the working age to provide pensions for people in the retirement age. This retirement scheme plays a big role in the much broader social security system in France. And this social security system is huge. The government spends around 15% of France's entire GDP on it. Social security provides a lot of benefits, as it provides free healthcare and state pensions for everyone. But unfortunately, it's not sustainable. For a long time, the French government has run on a budget deficit. It spends more money than it collects in taxes. When you look at this chart, it becomes obvious that there's a problem. France's debt as a percentage of GDP has been rising for years. This means that its government's debt is growing at a faster rate than France's overall economy. Everyone can tell that this isn't a sustainable policy. Eventually, your debt is going to reach unhealthy levels. So the French government is looking at ways to prevent this from happening. A good way to do this is by cutting spending. The Social Security system, where the government spends 15% of the country's GDP, is one of the places to do this. It's a huge expense which the government can't afford, at least when you look at the debt figures. By raising the minimum pension age by 2 years, President Macron hopes to solve this issue. But let's take a look at the underlying problem here. Why is France's economy not able to afford its social security system in the first place? After all, the system was never designed to put France into a budget deficit. The idea was that the working taxpayers would always be able to pay for the retirees. But that's just not the case anymore. Apparently, France doesn't have enough income from taxes to put into its social security program. This chart explains it all. France's median age is rising at a very fast rate. It now sits at around 42 years old, which means that probably around half of France's population is older than 42. Now, this has some huge effects on the social security system. There are more elderly retirees and less tax-generating people of working age in the country. Back in the 1960s, France had 4 workers for every retiree. That number now stands at 1.7 workers per retiree. This means that there are less workers for the government to tax and more retirees for the government to pay for. Because of this demographic reality, France's social security system is running into deficits every year. After all, how can 17 workers realistically pay for the pensions of 10 retirees? The demographics of France are messing up its social security system. The only way forward being to raise the retirement age? You'll get more workers and less retirees, which will solve the problem in the short term. But obviously, this isn't too popular in France. As we've seen in the last few weeks, millions of people went onto the streets to protest this decision. Protesters clashed with police and started fires in the streets. So France's demographic problem is causing a lot of civil unrest. But what if I were to tell you that France isn't the only one? Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, all of these other European countries are facing the same kind of challenges. This has one reason. Europe is aging very fast. Just like it did in France, this will cause some serious problems. Let's look at Europe's demographic crisis in more detail. When we're looking at demographics, one of the most important things to discuss is the fertility rate. That's how many babies every woman has on average. In most developed countries, you'll need on average 2.1 births per woman to keep the population stable. Guess what the number in Europe is? In 2021, it was 1.53. Just look at this chart showing the historic fertility rate in Europe. For decades, the numbers have been below the replacement level of 2.1. The fertility rate in Europe has been way too low for way too long. When we do the math, it's hard to deny that there's a problem here. With a birth rate of 1.5, every generation will shrink by 25%. We will dive into the reasons for all of this later, but first we need to realize how big of an issue this really is. With less and less people being born, the population is getting older and older. A lot of important systems can collapse because of this. Think about what's happening in France as an example. There are too many elderly and too few working people to keep the pension system working. All across Europe, there's a similar demographic imbalance. This has to do with the old age dependency ratio, the amount of people older than 65 compared to the amount of people younger than 65. On this chart, you can see that this ratio is increasing rapidly in Europe. In 2022, it was already as high as 33%. To put the math into words, there are only 3 people under the age of 65 for every elderly above this age. And bad news for Europe, this will only get worse as time goes on. In 2100, the old age dependency ratio is projected to be at 57%. In the future, there will be less than 2 younger people for every elderly person in Europe. This can cause the collapse of a lot of systems on the continent. Not only the European pension systems, but also their healthcare systems and financial systems will feel the effects of this. Let me break down the reasons for this. older people don't work as much as younger people. In Europe, most people retire at the age of 64. Retirees don't produce things for the economy anymore. But they do need a lot of financial and social support. The elderly receives pensions and need to use things like the healthcare system. In France, we've seen that the pension thing doesn't work out if you don't have young people to support it. The French government needs to receive taxes to give out pensions to retirees. To collect those taxes, you need people under 65 who are driving the economy forward. With the healthcare system, it's exactly the same. To have a functioning healthcare system, you need doctors and nurses. Most of the time, those people are under 65. But remember that Europe has only around 3 people under 65 for every retiree, soon to be 2. There are only 3 people to provide the financial support for every retiree, which is asking a lot. As if this wasn't bad enough, the aging European population is also terrible for the economy. With a fertility rate of 1.53, the new generations in Europe are getting smaller and smaller. Inevitably, the labor market will suffer from this. 25 years from now, the labor market could get really tight as there will be fewer Europeans who want to take a job. When companies can't find people to work, well, they move away. The smaller labor market could then lead to an economic slowdown. With extremely low fertility rates, this is a very real scenario in Europe. Now, some European countries have already found a solution to this: immigration. But first, I'd like to talk about why this is happening in Europe and not anywhere else. To be fair, Europe is not the only continent facing a problem with demographics. On the contrary, most developed countries are having problems with aging. But Europe is just the first one to feel the harsh effects of it. This chart shows the fertility rate per continent. In every part of the world, they're falling. Over the last 70 years, global fertility rates fell by 50%. But Europe just has the worst fertility rates among them all. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. China, Japan, and South Korea all have very low fertility rates too. But what's causing this huge decline in fertility rates in the first place? We'll take 2 countries as example: Congo and Italy. The two are very different in a lot of ways, including in their fertility rates. According to the World Bank, Congo has a fertility rate of 6.2, and Italy one of 1.2. The people in Congo have way more kids than people in Italy. There are a lot of reasons for this, including religion, culture, whether women have jobs, or infertility. But the biggest factor may be this: how developed a country is. Most people in Congo are farmers. Kids can help their parents out on the farm, so it simply makes sense for them to have a lot of children. And when these farmers get old, they need to have a lot of kids to take care of them. The government of Congo isn't going to help them out with pensions, so having children is a must. In Italy, however, most people work in the service industry. When you're working at a bank or a school in Italy, there isn't a lot of economic incentive to have kids. Having a lot of children will take a lot of time and money, and you don't need to anyway. After all, when you retire, the Italian government takes care of your pensions. That's why in Congo, having kids is necessary. But in Italy, the opposite is true. In general, developed countries have lower fertility rates than underdeveloped ones. Over the last 70 years, the world has developed a lot, which is the main reason for global fertility rates dropping by 50%. Globally, people have fewer reasons to have a lot of children. Europe is just ahead of other continents in this trend. Europe and North America have been the most developed continents in the world for decades, and with extensive social security programs provided by governments, there is even less of a need to have children in Europe. With things like pensions, healthcare, and unemployment already taken care of by the state, you don't need children for your social security. This is why Europe is leading the way in the fertility rate decline. But countries outside of Europe could soon follow. We've already talked about the problems that low fertility rates can bring to a country. It leads to an aging population, which could damage Europe's economy and threaten systems like healthcare or retirement. Remember, Europe will only have 2 people under 65 for every person above it in the foreseeable future. To prevent the huge demographic problems from getting out of hand, Europe needs to quickly find a solution to the aging of their population. The most obvious solution is getting more children, which is kind of ironic. When Europe developed, Europeans thought that having a lot of children wouldn't be necessary anymore. After all, the government would provide the pensions and the healthcare for them, right? But now this whole system threatens to collapse precisely because Europe doesn't have enough children. To prevent this from happening, Europe needs to increase its fertility rate from an unstable 1.53 to a stable 2.1. But this is easier said than done. First of all, how are you going to encourage people to have more kids in the first place? As Europe became more developed, many countries implemented child allowances. Basically, European governments pay their citizens to have kids in what are called family benefits. For example, parents in Germany can receive up to €250 every month to raise their child. Through such financial incentives, governments hope to crank up their fertility rates. Across the European Union, countries have spent €315 billion on family benefits in 2019. This spending has increased by 43% since 2000, according to Eurostat data. But in spite of the financial encouragement, the programs haven't worked particularly well, at least when we look at fertility rates. Child allowances have been around for a while now, but fertility rates haven't improved at all. You can say that people in Europe still aren't motivated enough to have more children. And even if European governments find the secret formula to crank up fertility rates back to 2.1, it might be too late. Fertility rates under this replacement level of 2.1 have a delayed effect. When people have fewer babies now, it will only affect the labor market 20 years from now. How many 20-year-olds there will be in 2043 is already pretty much set in stone. If Europe is already having problems now, there is nothing it can do to resolve that in the short term. Or is there? Luckily for Europe, it has one more trick up its sleeve, and that is immigration. In 2021 alone, Europe took in around 2.3 million immigrants. These immigrants were significantly younger than the average European, aged 30 years old on average. In 2022, 5.3% of the people living in the European Union were born outside of the EU. It's clear what the strategy here is. Europe wants to take in young immigrants to fill up the gaps in the labor market. In France, the country that is struggling with its pension system due to an aging population, 10% of the population was born in a foreign country. And that figure of 10% excludes the children of those immigrants who were born in France. Most of these immigrants come from Africa, where the fertility rates are much higher. For France, it doesn't take much of a sales pitch to get immigrants into its country. Immigrants have a lot more opportunities in France than most of the time in their home country. France just has a better education system and better paying jobs than most countries in Africa. So, this is a win-win situation, right? France gets the young people they need for their labor market, and the immigrants get a brighter future for themselves. But every solution has its pros and cons. Not everyone in France, and in Europe more generally, are happy with mass immigration. Some more conservative political parties are afraid that a large foreign population has some negative effects. They fear that it endangers their country's traditional culture, leads to higher crime rates, and that it takes away economic opportunities for young Europeans. Okay, now I won't go too deep in the rabbit hole of European immigration policies, but it's important to understand that immigration is a divisive topic in European countries. Some political parties see immigration as a solution to the aging problem, but other political parties think the negative effects far outweigh the positive effects of immigration. Because of this clear divide, immigration might not always be the solution. When fertility rates stay at their current low levels, European countries would have to keep inviting millions of new people into their borders for years. Many Europeans aren't in favor of this idea, making it hard for governments to get political backing for it. Immigration is still a good short-term solution to Europe's aging problem. But in the long term, Europe has to fix the underlying problem, their fertility rate. Unfortunately, I don't have a magic solution to fix this issue, but Europe has to figure it out fast. Otherwise, the protests in France can escalate into something much bigger. This is France. The scale of the riots is moving into uncharted territory for France. According to President Macron, the destruction that has taken place is already worse than the infamous 2005 French riots. Nearly 500 public buildings have been burnt down, 1,000+ people have been arrested, and hundreds of police officers have been injured. Things have gotten so bad that the government has decided to deploy 45,000 police personnel to try to get things under control. The riot started because of news that 2 police officers had shot and killed a 17-year-old boy of Algerian descent. This happened at a traffic stop after the teenager had broken some traffic laws. Initially, the officers claimed that they fired because the boy was driving straight toward the officers, but videos captured by bystanders show things a little bit differently. This is the most widespread video from the internet. I'll show a little bit of the video, but I can't really show the whole thing here because, you know, a person is getting shot in this video. Showing that will most definitely get this video deleted and quite possibly get the channel demonetized. So please, be sure to hit that like button below. Covering risky topics like these doesn't help me with the algorithm, which suppresses anything that's not brand friendly. So your likes are the only thing helping me with the algorithm. Alright, let's get to the video. I'll explain what happened, but if anyone wants to watch the whole video, I'm sure you can find it somewhere on Twitter. As you can see from the first few seconds of the clip, 2 officers were involved in the traffic stop. One of them had his weapon pointed at the driver. According to the reports, there's a voice heard in the recording saying, "You're going to get a bullet in the head." I'm guessing that was one of the officers who said that. This is when the driver starts taking off. Then the officer leaning on the hood and pointing his weapon at the driver fired their weapon as the car was taking off. The car then goes on for a few hundred feet before crashing. It was later found that the driver, Niall, died shortly after due to the injuries from the gunshot. This incident is what gave rise to the riots. Many have compared these riots to 2005, when weeks-long riots broke out after the deaths of 2 young boys hiding from the police in an electricity substation. As a result, 3 consecutive nights of violence have rocked major French cities, including Paris, Marseille, Lyon, Toulouse, Strasbourg, and Lille. Buildings have been set ablaze, vehicles torched, and stores looted, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Faced with this escalating crisis, the French government has deployed an unprecedented 45,000 police officers to restore order. President Emmanuel Macron finds himself grappling with the gravest leadership challenge since the Yellow Vest protests that shook the nation in 2018.
We have a teenager who's been killed. It's inexplicable, inexcusable. First of all, I want to express my sorrow and support for his family and loved ones. Secondly, the case was immediately referred to the courts. I hope that it will carry out its work quickly, with the calm that this work requires, and that the truth can be established as soon as possible, and that, of course, we are all informed and that justice is done.
The Interior Minister has called for decisive action in the coming hours, and has not ruled out any measures, including the declaration of a state of emergency. However, the situation remains tense, and any further escalation could lead to unrest spreading in the heart of France's major cities. Amidst the chaos, President Macron left a European Union summit in Brussels to attend a second cabinet crisis meeting in 2 days. He has also appealed to social media platforms to remove sensitive videos and identify individuals inciting violence. The riots have not only impacted the streets, but have also disrupted daily life. Concerts and events, including 2 concerts at the Stade de France, have been cancelled. Even the upcoming Tour de France has organizers on high alert as they prepare to adapt to any potential disruptions. As tensions continue to rise, protests and clashes have taken place throughout the country. The iconic central Paris square, Place de la Concorde, witnessed confrontations between protesters and police. Shops have been ransacked, and public buildings, including schools and town halls, have been attacked. The international community is closely watching these events unfold. Western governments have issued warnings to their citizens traveling to France, urging caution. The United Nations has emphasized the importance of peaceful assembly, while calling on French authorities to ensure non-discriminatory use of force by the police. Though the death of the teenager is what triggered the riots, the real reason lies deeper. The main reason behind the riots is to bring attention to a broader row of issues over police tactics in France. Though the prosecutor has already opened an investigation for manslaughter against the police officer, many believe that the incident is rooted in deeper problems in French society. The accused officer, however, claims that he fired his gun out of fear that the boy would run somebody over with the car. This was the 3rd killing this year during a police traffic stop, after a record 13 deaths last year. Most of the victims have been black or Arab. Now, to truly understand the cause of the problem in French society, we have to look at France's demographics. I know I've already made a video about issues issues with France's demographics after the protests that happened over the new pension law, but in that video we looked at the French population's age. In this video, we have to understand France's racial demographics to truly understand how we got to what's happening today. To get a complete picture of the French racial demographic, we have to back up a little and start from the 1920s. After the end of the First World War, French leaders realized the size of the population plays a huge role in who wins a war, and France's population was in the decline. So leaders made a huge push to grow the population through encouraging more births and opening up the country to immigration. Hundreds of thousands of Poles, Belgians, and Italians came to live in France between the two world wars. Similarly, after the Second World War, in the years of economic expansion, there was an acute labor shortage, so immigration again reached a high level. But this time immigrants came from North Africa, notably Algeria, an integral part of France until 1962, and the former protectorates of Morocco and Tunisia. People from French or former French territories in Central Africa, Asia, and the Americas provided an additional source of immigration. Initially, these immigrants were viewed as temporary economic migrants, but slowly, these individuals have increasingly been accepted as permanent residents in France. Many have taken up citizenship and brought over families or had children in France. This has led to the transformation of France into a multi-ethnic society, even though many continue to refer to non-whites in the country as immigrants, regardless of where they were born. Now, this is where I want to point out a unique French law. Unlike many other Western European countries, and very much unlike English-speaking immigrant societies like the United States, Canada, or Australia, France has intentionally avoided implementing race-conscious policies. There are no public policies in France that target benefits or confer recognition on groups defined as races. For many Frenchmen, the very term race sends shivers running down their spines, since it tends to remind them of the atrocities of Nazi Germany and the complicity of France's Vichy regime in deporting Jews to concentration camps. Race is such a taboo term that a 1978 law specifically banned the collection and computerized storage of race-based data without the express consent of the interviewees or a waiver by a state committee. France therefore collects no census or other data on the race or ethnicity of its citizens. This means that today, France is an ethnically diverse country, but its leaders don't have much reliable data on that diversity. Peter Zion recently published a good video explaining the problems with this issue. Basically, what it boils down to is that France's leaders haven't been able to appropriate proper resources to help different groups become more educated and increase their earning potential. Usually, these non-ethnic French, who are not as well off as ethnic French, are all congregated together outside the cities away from the ethnic French. Law enforcement presence is usually high in these areas because of the high crime rate, which in turn has made residents in the area unfriendly towards police officers. And in turn, this has led to more incidents between residents and police officers. Again, this is a very complicated issue. I'm trying my best to explain it without making it political. One thing I can say for certain is that violence is most definitely not the answer to the issues here. If you have any more insights on this situation, please feel free to share it down in the comments. I don't consider myself an expert here, and I'm definitely interested in learning more about this. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that like button so YouTube knows that this is a video that's worth telling people about. Thank you.
The sad truth is, Italy is dying.
Italy's national birth rate has fallen to its lowest level on record.
Sicily, demographers warn that the shrinking population could drag the country into an unprecedented economic crisis.
And its economy is collapsing with it.
That is their debt to GDP level, currently sitting at around 150%, the second highest in the Eurozone.
Now, the European Commission has warned Italy it will launch disciplinary steps over the country's growing debt.
Yes, I said that. Third time in a decade, Italy's economy has slipped into recession.
Over 24% of Italy's population is over 65, and this number is only rising. We're not the first one to mention this. Italy's very own health minister is also worrying about this. She's quoted saying that Italy is a dying country. So what's the problem? What's killing Italy? It has to do with two words: fertility rates. This refers to the number of babies each woman has on average. The fertility rate in Italy is one of the lowest in the world, with a number of 1.24 births per woman. To maintain a stable population, you need a fertility rate of about 2.1. Because of this fact, Italy's number of 1.24 is making its population very unstable. So unstable, in fact, that a population collapse is not only coming, it's inevitable. For years now, Italy has had fewer births than deaths, slowly chipping away at its total population number. In 2022, the country recorded a record low number of births. It had less than 400,000 newborns, with a total population of about 59 million people. Imagine that. For years now, the country's population has been falling by around 200,000 every year. This huge population decline began back in 2015, and the trend is only worsening. Keep in mind that a population decline is inevitable when birth rates stay low. Every new generation could just become smaller and smaller to the point of no return. Elon Musk is worried about this possibility, saying that Italy will have no people if these trends continue. This is no exaggeration, as it is happening in some places already. Around 6,000 rural villages in the country have been abandoned, and 15,000 could soon follow. The rapidly aging population is the main cause of this, as once thriving villages have become empty ghost towns. And this isn't the only effect of the aging population, or even the biggest one. Demographics are one of the most important statistics for a country because they play a role in almost every system in society. The economy, politics, and the welfare system are all closely intertwined with demographics. And that's why a demographic collapse is a terrible thing, because it causes all kinds of systems to crumble. These problems won't just remain in nursing homes, but they will plague the entire society. If these unstable birth rates continue, Italy is in for a time of nationwide unrest and economic downturn. Let's go over how this dire situation formed in the first place. We'll also look at all the problems that will emerge in Italy due to the ongoing demographic crisis. But before we continue with the video, here's a quick reminder to hit the like button down below. Topics like these are important to cover because they inform you about the fate of entire nations, but we can only make videos about these topics with your support because otherwise the YouTube algorithm will suppress them. If you want to support the channel, please like the video and leave a comment down below. Without further ado, let's go into the basics. Right now, the country's demographic collapse is going on in full swing because of extremely low fertility rates. But just 50 years ago, the situation in Italy was a whole lot different. In the 1970s, the fertility rate was about 2.5, meaning that the population was steadily growing. But still, a rate of 2.5 isn't that much according to historical Italian standards. 100 years earlier, Italy had a fertility rate of about 5, double the number of 1970. However, this doesn't mean that the average family had 5 children. One of the causes for this high statistic was the sad reality of infant mortality. In Italy of the 1800, around 40% of newborns didn't make it past the age of 5. But in spite of this, the population was still growing throughout the 19th century. The entire phenomena of an aging population just didn't exist at the time. The question is why? What has changed over the last 100 years that made fertility rates plummet? First of all, the incentives for having children changed. Italy was a mostly agricultural society in the 19th century, although the country was slowly industrializing. This meant that for most Italians, having kids was a no-brainer. If you didn't have kids as a farmer, there was nobody to take care of you once you got older. The centralized state as we know it now didn't exist back then, so there were no pensions and no social security. Having children was necessary for your future self. On top of that, there was actually a financial incentive to get kids during that time. There was no law banning child labor, and it was common practice all over Europe. Children worked in the fields or in the workshops of their families, providing a source of labor and income for their parents. Children were actually a net positive for their parents' wallets. During the early days of the Industrial Revolution, parents even sent their children to work in factories. This terrible practice gave poor families a desperately needed source of income. Apart from these social and economic incentives, there was also cultural and religious factors making the birth rates so high. 100 years ago, having a large family was very much respected in Italian culture. Raising and being part of a large family gave people a certain social status. The family culture is one of the reasons why the Italian mafia is so infamous, with families fighting entire wars. This just shows you how serious family is in Italian culture. Another influence was the Catholic Church, which had a lot of power within the society back then. It says that large families are a blessing from God and that it's virtuous to raise children. This moved people in their beliefs, resulting in higher birth rates. But all of these reasons to have kids came crumbling down during the 20th century. Social, economic, cultural, or religious, everything has changed. This can be seen in the numbers. Over the course of 100 years, fertility rates were slashed by about 70%. Now, how did this happen? First of all, having children isn't a no-brainer like it was previously in history. Right now, Italy has a free or low-cost healthcare system, a state pension system, and various other social security benefits. Basically, the need to have children to take care of you is gone. Italy's government takes care of people financially and physically, which reduces the need for children in the first place. In some ways, these government policies have caused the decline in birth rates. However, the government isn't the only one to blame for the problem. In the modern world, there's also no financial incentive anymore for having kids. Child labor has been abolished, which everybody can agree on is a good thing. But on top of this, the financial burden of having children has also dramatically increased. From age 0 to 18, the average cost for the parents is now about 175,000 euros in Italy. This varies between higher income and lower income families, with the latter spending less generally. But still, that's about 10,000 euro a year on average for just one child. The average Italian makes about 30,000 euro a year, so good luck raising multiple kids. Having just one baby costs more than 30% of the average income, so raising more is a luxury that most Italians can't afford. Pope Francis has blamed this issue on savage free market conditions. He said that starting a family is a titanic effort, something that only the rich can afford. Looking at the numbers, he's got a point. If it's unaffordable for the average couple to have 2 children, there's arguably something wrong with the economy. So the bad side of the Italian economic system also plays a role in the issue. Another cause of the birth rate collapse is the giant cultural shift that has been taking place since the 1960s or so. We're not going to get political here, but the culture shift definitely has an impact on birth rates worth mentioning. Starting a family was part of a traditional worldview, which was widespread a few hundred years ago. But with the rise of countercultures, these traditional ideals have become less and less important in society. The rise of feminism is directly linked to lower fertility rates, which is proven in a majority of studies. Because of these movements, the traditional idea of having large families has been abandoned. This happened all over the Western world, including in Italy. In some way, lower fertility rates have become the new cultural norm. And this isn't only a cultural shift, but also a religious one. As it did in many European countries, religion has become less and less important in Italy. Traditionally, the country had a vast majority of Roman Catholics, and looking at the data, about 80% of Italians still call themselves Catholic in 2021. But when it comes to actual church attendance, well, the numbers are much lower. In 2020, about 12 million Italians went to church every week, which is around 20% of the population. The vast majority of this group are elderly, and the percentages among newer generations are much lower. It's safe to say that the newer generations are less religious than 100 years ago. Now, a religious population has a higher fertility rate on average according to scientific data. As Italy is becoming more of a secular country, fertility rates have been dropping as a result. In short, it's clear that the demographic collapse doesn't have just one cause, but many. Government policy, economic incentives, and a cultural shift are just some of the major ones. But apart from having many causes, a birth rate decline will also have many effects.
And that is their debt to GDP level, currently sitting at around 150%, the second highest in the Eurozone.
Now, the European Commission has warned Italy it will launch disciplinary steps over the country's growing debt.
Third time in a decade, Italy's economy has slipped into recession.
So we now understand the reasons behind the plummeting birth rates. But it's even more interesting to look at what will happen in the future, and it doesn't look good in many regards, especially economically. Because of the demographic crisis, Italy is heading for an economic collapse. This might seem an overstatement, but sadly, it's not. The country already has one of the weakest economies in Europe when we look at the data. Italy is one of the few developed countries that barely grew its GDP over the last 20 years. When we look at GDP at purchasing power parity, which basically adjusts the number for inflation, the country's economy hasn't grown at all. Compared to France or the United Kingdom, it's clear that Italy is an underperformer. While other countries have grown their economy, Italy has gone into recessions 3 times over the last decade. Right now, there are fears that it will enter a 4th. It's no exaggeration to say that the country is having a hard time economically already. Sadly enough, the demographic crisis will make this even worse. You see, birth rates are a key part of economic prosperity, and low rates can cause economic downturn. Just to be concise here, high birth rates aren't traditionally associated with economic success. Economic development usually goes hand in hand with lower birth rates, as countries with higher rates are mostly underdeveloped. But we have to make the difference between low birth rates and extremely low birth rates. When they are so low that they cause a population to collapse, an economic downfall is inevitable. You don't have to be an economist to understand this. The fewer people there are, the fewer customers and workers for Italy's economy. If there are fewer people to buy and produce goods and services, you have an economic contraction. So this population decline will have a negative impact on Italy's GDP growth in the long run. This sets Italy up to be an underperformer far into the future. In the short term, we'll also see another problem emerge: extreme labor shortages. If you do the math, a fertility rate of 1.2 means that every generation shrinks by about 40%, so the younger generations in Italy are shrinking at scary rates. This is having a huge effect on the labor force because there are the people who are supposed to work jobs. According to a prominent Italian businessman, the upcoming labor shortage is a ticking time bomb. Soon, businesses will start to leave the country because there just aren't enough people there. When companies start leaving the country, an economic downturn is inevitable, and the problems go far beyond that. Because of a lack of people, the Italian government is struggling to get projects off the ground. A recent example of this are the infrastructure projects that were paused this year. To get its economy back on its feet, Italy has recently received 191.5 billion euros from the EU. However, the infrastructure projects that were supposed to be funded with this money couldn't be started. Because of labor shortages, Italy isn't even able to invest in its own economy. And no wonder. With current trends, 110,000 to 120,000 fewer students enter Italian classrooms each year. So the amount of people in Italy's schools will decline by 1 million within a decade. This will cause problems both for companies and the government, because there just aren't enough people to fill the jobs. To make it even worse, Italy is also facing a huge brain drain. Around 50,000 young people leave the country every year to find better jobs elsewhere. In France, Germany, or Switzerland, salaries are way higher, meaning that young Italians would rather work abroad. Many of the people who end up leaving are degree holders, which is a relatively small group in the country. Only 28% of Italians between 25 and 34 hold degrees, far below the European average of 41%. This means that the country has a very small pool of highly educated people, many of whom end up leaving. This lack of talent could help with Italy's economic demise because the country's economic growth relies on it. When Italy doesn't have enough scientists, engineers, or software developers, it won't be able to compete in the modern economy. There's already talk of a skills shortage in the country, with companies struggling to find qualified employees. This is just another reason for businesses to leave and for Italy's economy to underperform. So the overall economics of the country don't look all too exciting. On a government financial level, it's just the same. Italy's national debt burden is the fourth biggest in the world, with its government building more than 156% of the country's GDP in debts. The government has consistently run into budget deficits because it can't finance all of its expenses. With one of the biggest debt burdens in the world, investors fear that Italy is becoming a risky place to put money into. Italy wouldn't be the first country to run into problems with its debt, as it has already happened during the Eurozone crisis. Starting in 2009, multiple EU countries were unable to repay their debts. These countries were Greece, Cyprus, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. Because EU countries share the same currency, this crisis affected the entire Union as the euro depreciated in value. It also sparked controversy within the Union because the richer countries like Germany didn't want to bail out other member states. They said that the unsustainable debt levels weren't their problem. Countries like Greece were to blame for not being frugal enough, according to some EU members. Because of these internal issues, the Eurozone crisis has threatened the very existence of the EU. When we look at it from a historical perspective, the debt situation in Italy is a ticking time bomb, and the demographic crisis might be the spark to ignite it. You see, the Italian government needs to do two things financially. First of all, it needs to spend money on public services, infrastructure, defense, and whatnot. Things like these are essential to keep a country up and running. But in order to spend this money, the government needs to collect money through taxes. And this is where government in Italy is running into issues because of its rapidly aging population. A majority of the taxes come from economically productive people, which means people working jobs or running businesses. But this economically productive population is shrinking every year because of the low fertility rates. We've already discussed how every newer generation is shrinking by 40%. Inevitably, this means that tax revenue will go down when tax rates don't go up. To make matters even worse, government expenses will only rise in the upcoming decades. The average life expectancy in Italy has risen significantly over the last decades, meaning that the older generations live longer. For the Italian government, this could be a huge problem. Elderly people don't bring as much tax revenue, but they cost a lot in the form of healthcare and pensions. So this part of the population is a net negative for the national finances. And slowly but surely, the elderly part of the population is becoming bigger and bigger. According to this chart, the elderly share of the population is rising with 0.3% a year pretty consistently. Because of these demographic trends, Italy is going to have lower tax revenue and higher government expenses. For a country already heavily indebted, this is not sustainable. The Italian government will be running at an even bigger budget deficit, which can't continue without causing problems. It has two choices. Italy can either dramatically cut government expenses or dramatically increase tax rates. Oh yeah, the third option is to keep printing money like it's doing now, but we all know how that one ends. With financial disaster, of course. So, the government is in a difficult place financially, to say the least. Right at the center of all their financial problems is the country's pension system. Because of the way that it's organized, this pension system is in a dire situation. Like many other European nations, Italy has a centralized pay-as-you-go pension system. In pay-as-you-go systems, the currently employed population pays for the retirement of the retired population. Basically, this means that the younger generation is supporting the older generation's retirement, but you can see where this goes sideways. In the near future, this type of system should collapse because of aging populations. For one, the sheer amount of pensions Italy has to pay is getting out of hand. The country spends about 70% of its GDP on pensions right now. Yes, that's 17% of the entire economy. This figure will only get worse in the future because of the demographic collapse. First of all, the percentage of retirees in Italy's population is growing rapidly. This means that Italy will need to pay more and more people in the future, relatively speaking. But on the other hand, the younger generation is rapidly shrinking, and this younger generation is the one who's supposed to pay for the retirement of the elderly. In short, the Italian retirement system is headed for collapse. To truly reveal how bad it is, let's look at the old age dependency ratio. This statistic is the number of retirees for every person in the working population. Right now, Italy has about 38 elderly people for every 100 people in working age, but according to OECD projections, this will increase to more than 70 by 2050. This means that everyone within working age has to support about 70% of someone's pension, roughly speaking. That equals to about 9,000 euros every year, or 30% of the average Italian's income. So Italians within working will have to pay about 30% of their income to fund someone else's retirement. This, of course, is not very feasible, as it would be a huge burden on the younger generation. Politicians in Rome are scrambling for solutions to deal with this issue, with attempts to try and reform the retirement program. Over the long term, Italy may be able to abandon the pay-as-you-go pension system. When every generation pays for its own retirement, it would be much more stable. But such a transition would take multiple decades because the current older generation is still dependent on the younger one. The government in Italy can't leave retirees on their own because they are still entitled to receive pensions from the government. That's why the pension reform is going to be slow and painful. But the question is, if Italy has multiple decades left before its pension system collapses, the government in Rome is already facing huge budget deficits, and its national debt is also getting out of hand. If the country has to spend billions of euros extra on pensions, that could be the last straw.
Early results from Italy's election show a clear victory for an alliance of right-wing parties.
Some 31,000 or so migrants have arrived here in Italy on the sea route in the last couple of months of this year. Now, compare that to 2021 and 2022. It's 4 times the number.
So it's clear that Italy faces a lot of headwinds because of its demographic collapse. This will, of course, have a big impact on politics in the country, as it will have to deal with economic and governmental problems. But one thing is clear, because Italy is a democracy, there will be one winner in the upcoming political debate, the elderly part of the population. The parties supporting old people will have the biggest political say in Italy because they have the most votes. Undoubtedly, this will create a lot of societal tension. Old people want to keep the retirement age low, receive their pensions, and retain free healthcare. The problem is that Italy can hardly afford these things in the future. When the old generation wants to keep all the benefits, it comes at a great cost for the younger generation. First of all, the government needs to increase tax rates to fund the welfare programs for the elderly. Increasing tax rates comes with huge economic cost, as businesses and people will leave the country, so high tax rates would hurt the economy and therefore the younger generation. It will lead to an economic decline and worse living standards for the newer generations. If the government increases its taxes, it's basically sacrificing its economy for the welfare of the elderly. The only other way to keep the welfare programs running is government debt, but there are limits to how much money Italy can lend, because of the risks associated with it. In the European Union, countries are officially only allowed to have 60% of their GDP in debt. This is to prevent something like the Eurozone crisis from ever happening again. However, many countries don't listen to this rule, with Italy currently having 144% of its GDP in debt. This puts Italy in a tricky position. Other EU countries, especially Germany, don't want Italy to increase its obligations. When Italy borrows billions of euros more, it will create tension with other EU countries, and even if the country manages to borrow more money, debt still carries a cost. Everyone knows that borrowed money is never free money. High government debt leads to a high interest payments and inflation. In 2022, Italy had to pay 4.4% of its GDP on the interest payouts for its debt, or close to $90 billion. Increasing debt even more will make these interest payouts even bigger, to the point where it's unsustainable. On top of that, government debt also has a tendency to cause inflation. If the Italian government pumps billions of euros into its economy, the total supply of money increases. According to basic economic theory, an increase in supply makes the value go down. This is also known as inflation. When the Italian government funds its welfare with debt, it would lead to economic unrest. The younger generation will suffer from this the most, because they need to pay the interest on the national debt. On top of that, inflation will cause the generation's living standards to go down. The retirees have less of a problem with this because their pensions are inflation adjusted to some extent. In short, the younger generation is in a bit of a pickle. It will carry the cost of the demographic collapse, but the generation has very little political say. To prevent it from getting completely out of hand, the government in Rome will have to make a difficult decision. It has to increase the retirement age, which is currently at 67. A higher retirement age decreases the expenses for government welfare and increases tax revenue from workers. The problem is, nobody likes a higher retirement age. If Italy increases it to, say, 70 years old, mass protests and riots will follow. Just look at what happened in France just after Macron raised the retirement age there. But maybe it's better to have short-term anger than long-term political unrest. If the retirement age isn't raised, high taxes, government debt, and inflation could cause mass protests and riots just as well. This is a very difficult political problem, which definitely causes some headaches in Rome. Another political problem is an internal one. You see, Italy's decline isn't spread evenly across the nation. The southern parts of the nation have it way worse than the northern parts in virtually all aspects. It is said that Italy has the most geographically divided country in the European Union. The northern region of Lombardy has more than double the GDP per capita as the southern regions of Calabria or Sicily. Cities in the north have actually experienced growth over the last decades, but the economy in the south has been stagnant. We can see this in the figures of regional growth. The southern region of Calabria has only grown its GDP by 1% from 2010 to 2019. But the northern region of Trentino Alto Adige has grown by 21% over the same time period. This north-south difference is true for many regions, with some exceptions. Right now, the north of Italy is relatively rich for EU standards, but the south relatively poor. There are also some regional differences when it comes to fertility rates. Trentino South Tyrol has a fertility rate of almost 1.6, whereas Sardinia has one just under 1.0. Rates are fairly low throughout the country, but some areas have more acute problems than others. A fertility rate of 1 makes every generation 50% smaller, which is an insane experiment to run. Now, the variation in fertility rates isn't completely a north to south divide. Sicily, for example, has a fertility rate of about 1.4, the second biggest in Italy. But the differences in fertility rates aren't the main issue here. An even bigger factor is the mass migration of people in southern Italy. Almost 50% of the people leaving Italy come from the south, which means that the region's brain drain is disproportionately large. Another form of migration is the internal migration from southern to northern Italy. This internal migration isn't a new phenomena, as millions of Italians have moved up north since World War II. And no wonder, the salaries in the northern industrial cities are just way higher. The huge difference in GDP per capita are the main reason for this. Over the years, this has led to the populations of southern cities like Naples or Palermo dropping by the thousands. The problem is this: the biggest group of people who are leaving are in the age of 15 to 34. This means that the aging problem in southern cities is way worse than in the prosperous northern cities. If Italy is facing shortages in its workforce, the southern cities are the first ones to get in trouble. For the Italian government, this obviously brings some challenges. If the differences between the north and south continue to grow, it'll be hard to keep the country unified. With a huge divide in GDP per capita and economic success, northern Italy and southern Italy are just worlds apart. The demographic collapse will make this even worse, as southern Italy will feel the blow even more acutely. Another hot topic in Italy's politics is immigration, which is also related to low fertility rates. Right now, about 9% of Italy's population are foreigners, representing around 5.2 million people. This number has grown significantly over the last 20 years, because it was only 1.3 million in 2002. Most of Italy's immigrants come from poorer European countries, with 47.6% of immigrants coming from Europe. Interestingly enough, about 2 million of the immigrants in the country were born in Romania, being the biggest group of foreigners in Italy. But Northern Africa, Asia, and Latin America are also places where immigrants come from. 22.3% of immigrants were born in Africa, mainly in northern African nations like Morocco, Egypt, or Tunisia. Immigration from Asian countries represents 22.6% of total immigration. The fastest growing foreign population in Italy are actually the Chinese, with a population of 330,000 people in Italy. The other less substantial group of immigrants are Latin Americans, with about 7.5% of total immigration coming from the region. It's safe to say that Italy attracts people from all over the world. Of course, Italy is a beautiful country where many people would love to live. But the biggest reason for the immigration is actually the demographic collapse. Because Italy just has too few people to work jobs, people from the outside come to fill in the gap. In a way, immigration is compensating for the extremely low birth rates. But it doesn't come at a low cost, because there is a lot of opposition in Italy against migration. The country now has a right-wing government led by Prime Minister Meloni, which is opposed to mass migration. Recently, Meloni has said that migration isn't the way to solve the demographic crisis. If the birth rates continue to be as low as they are now, immigrants would make up an increasingly bigger part of the population. The right-wing government is afraid that this would change Italy's cultural identity and cause internal unrest. As many countries in Europe are shifting right, there's a good chance mass immigration will come to an end. Although some on the left see immigration as a solution for the population collapse, it won't happen because of the political reality. To sum it all up, it's clear that Italy is in major trouble. Because of financial, cultural, and social changes, fertility rates have collapsed in the country. This is going to cause extreme workforce shortages and an overall economic decline. The country is already an underperformer in Europe, something that could be worsened by the demographic collapse. Italy is starting to run into huge fiscal issues, with the government already loaded with trillions in debt. The welfare state with its pension system is completely unaffordable because the population is rapidly aging. Because of these problems, Italy is also headed to a difficult time politically. The younger generations will have a hard time supporting the elderly, which causes friction in society. With the huge south to north regional divide, Italy will become more divided than ever, and the left and the right will be fighting on whether immigration is a good or bad thing. Because of the upcoming demographic, economic, and political crisis, it's safe to say Italy is dying.